Thanks very much. It's great to be here and very exciting to start off them. And I'm a psychologist, behavioral scientist by training. I'll give you some insights into my type of research and how this could be helpful when we talk about plastic pollution and microplastic. And here's just a picture of some plastic pollution on a beach in France. It's just a little illustration where we might find it. Now, I want to start with the plastic system that Richard's also referred to quite a lot. And if you've heard one of my talks before, you might have seen this picture. I really like it because it illustrates the complex system we're dealing with. So I think most of us think about plastics from a systems view. So here it's depicted as a flow from economic sectors at the top through to society, and then sadly too often to the environment. Many of us are motivated to work in this area because we're worried about the environment. So that's the starting point. And increasingly we have this view of plastics as a system, and the idea is that we start cleaning up much earlier. So what Richard said about the designers, for example, that's right at the top of the plastic system, if you look at this picture. And this systems view applies to macro, micro, and nanoplastic. So I don't really see a difference there. Now, the point I want to make is there's no simple solution. There are so many different actors influencing the system with their actions. And to me, as a behavioral scientist, as a psychologist by training, the key point is that each node in the system is a decision point too. It's the human decisions that determine actions and consequences. So just some examples, we've heard about the cosmetics producer. It's always the baddie, it seems, who made the decision to add microplastics to face peels or lipsticks. Richard pointed out earlier, they didn't think about the end of life, so it ends up in the marine environment or in rivers and so on. I think they didn't even think about the consumers, because I'll show you in a minute some research we did where the consumers, the users, told us they don't want plastics in their cosmetics products either. So there's a real disconnect between these different perspectives. There may be the retailer who makes logistics and packaging choices that determine a whole load of plastic outcomes. And of course, consumers rejecting or demanding certain products or packaging. So to me, it's a really key point as a psychologist, as a behavioral scientist, that all of these things are determined by human actions and behavior. And it's not just the general public, it's also these stakeholder groups and the designer and the retailer who make these decisions. And in a way, that's good news, because we know an awful lot about the determinants of decisions and behaviors. Here's just a picture where I've picked some of the determinants we know about from the literature. I'm focusing on determinants described more in the psychology and behavior change literature. Can't cover everything here. So behavioral determinants become important when there are options. This may be an obvious point. If there are no options, if there's no choice, people can't make a decision. They can't choose a different product. They can't change their behavior. So that's just one precondition for using behavioral influences. And a key point I want to make here is really that information alone is not very powerful. So you see the knowledge at the bottom of the screen there. And often I hear people say, we just need to tell everyone how bad it is. We need to give them all the facts. And what the behavioral change literature says very clearly is that facts and information are not a powerful driver. It's all these other things that I've put around the decisions of behavior that really have a big influence. So for example, social norms. It really matters to us what other people around us do or what they approve of. Perceived control is really important. Two people in the same situation, they might have the objective same level of control. If one of them feels I can do something about it, they will make an effort and they will really try to change things. And also emotions, for example, they're very powerful triggers of behavior. They take a shortcut from perception to action. That's what the psychology literature shows. They don't require a lot of effortful analysis and cognitive capacity. So that's really useful when you're trying to make a decision. You're overloaded with decisions all the time. And just to say this point about information, we know also from health behavior, everyone knows we need to eat healthily, we need to do lots of exercise, and yet we don't always act on it. It's exactly the same here. Information is not the key driver of behavior. So that's one point I really want to make to all of you, and I'll come back, I'll give some examples later on. The other point I want to make here is that there are a range of mechanisms of change. So there are some top-down mechanisms such as laws being introduced, incentive programs, fines, all these economic drivers. There are also bottom-up actions, and Richard referred to consumers changing their behavior, and that's been quite powerful, particularly in plastic. And I just want to highlight these here so we don't get too fixated on one particular approach to change. And our view is that they work best if they work together. So there's a policy indicator from the top. Policymakers want to change something, and that's met with a ready public. So they want this change. And then things really start to happen because there's this synergy. So that's about the system. I also want to say a few things about the SAPEA evidence report that Richard already mentioned, mainly because of two things. There was a really great interest in the European Union here and also national policy that drove this. And so this report was released in 2019. And the really exciting thing for me as a behavioral scientist was that they were genuinely interested in looking at society, at the human dimension. And there were three big structures, three big chapters in the report, the structures shown here. So one was about the environment, what I've shown you on the system slide right at the bottom. One was about policies, really important way of addressing these issues and getting countries to work together. And the third one was about society. So the human dimension, what are the decisions people make? Where are the options where they can change things? Do they agree with this? What's their risk perception? So there was a big area of that. And to me, that was really exciting. And I ended up being the co-chair as a psychologist. And Richard said earlier, he couldn't imagine ending up doing this research. Well, I feel even more strongly that way because as a psychologist, it's not very normal thing to work on plastics. So the societal part is all about how social dynamics influence the system and how we can change behavior, how we can work with people's risk perception, with their benefit perceptions and so on. And I just want to show you some of the things we reported in SAPEA, because it sets a bit of the context. So how does this happen? You know, a problem emerges, people don't know anything about it, and then they start getting concerned and the NGOs get involved and so on. So I just want to show you a little bit of background here. One thing we reported was the number of scientific publications on microplastics. This is shown for 2011 to 2018 here. And you can see there were a lot more in that time period. And also the publications on food are increasing. Not as much as the general publications on microplastics, but also considerable. So you can see there's more scientific evidence, or at least scientific publications on the topic. But then not everyone reads scientific papers. Actually, very few people read scientific papers. You may be disappointed about. So what happened in the media? This is only data from 2017 and 18, and I don't have more recent data. But you can see the scientific evidence, the debate in society is increasing as well. So this is within 2 years, news articles about microplastics, and it really gets taken up through the media. This is traditional media. There's similar data for social media, and that's really important. That's how society starts discussing it and how it becomes a topic area. And then the third thing I want to show you is the systematic review that was done alongside the SAPEA report, which asks what themes are being covered in the scientific literature. And you can see on this slide that the themes were mainly about impact and incidents, so classic environmental science topics. There was a little bit about transport and about sources, but you can see this is much lower. And then very, very little on perception, on political aspects, on economic aspects. So the whole area that I've described as society is actually really under-researched. The environmental sciences and microplastics are much, much more advanced. And this is changing rapidly, but that's the starting point where we are. So I said earlier that perception is a driver of behavior. And what I want to do next is just give you some examples of where risk perception matters and how this has been treated. I want to start again with a little bit of an excerpt from the SAPEA report, where we looked at the general literature on risk perception. And there are a few things we pointed out in the report. For example, the risk assessment process can differ quite substantially between experts and non-experts. So experts use very different factors and assessment methods to assess risks. For example, let's take the example of flying on a plane. Experts would assess the risk of that in terms of number of annual fatalities, for example. That's a good objective statistics, and you can say actually flying is much less dangerous than driving a car. But that's not what non-experts do, what lay people do, what the general public does. They hear about a plane crash and they say, oh my God, that's horrible. The dread associated with a plane crash is the one that drives the risk perception. So if you ask the general public, they would probably say flying is quite dangerous because you've got these very rare events that are really full of dread, full of emotion, whereas a car, you drive it almost every day, and that influences the different risk assessments. This might be a little bit controversial, but I would say one is not intrinsically better than the other if you're trying to manage a risk in society, because why should the experts decide what the risk is and how to assess it if people have their own opinions about it, and they might accept and support a measure or they might be against it? We need to really consider both of them. And what we've seen is either social amplification, where the public is a lot more concerned about a risk than the experts are. And we've also seen in some cases social attenuation. And I think climate change might be an example for social attenuation. I don't know, that could be debated, but it seems people aren't very concerned about climate change, or at least not as concerned as they are about plastic, as Richard pointed out. Risk perception is not just about facts. This links back to what I said earlier about information. Trust matters. Who tells you about the risk? It really matters. Values matter. Is the marine environment, the natural environment, really important to you? And if we don't know what the risk is, if we don't have enough evidence, it's really important to say that as well. So transparent communication does increase trust. There's a debate around fear messages. So this is the thing where people say we just need to tell everyone how bad it is. The discussion is, do people deny this if it's too scary, or does it actually motivate action? There's big literature around this. And also sometimes this can be misleading. I've seen some NGO messages, for example, that really evoke fear in people, but that are, to be honest, not really based on any evidence I've seen. So this is quite a complex area as well. I want to just show you a few examples of how we've looked at risk perception. So bear with me, I'll just run through these fairly quickly. A few years ago, Richard and I were involved in a big European project that was called Microscopic, and one of our tasks was to see if people were concerned, in this case, about marine litter. So we ran a large survey with not just the general public, but also various stakeholder groups. And we asked them a range of questions, and this is the overall picture about concern. So people said marine litter is an important problem. They said the quantity of litter on the coast and sea is increasing, and they said, I'm very concerned, that's me personal. And then we asked them a few questions that would allow them to say, well, actually, it's not that big a problem. And they pretty much disagreed with those. So these are the ones at the bottom. For example, marine litter is a problem elsewhere, but not in my country. It's a bit like how they measure these things in climate change. So you allow people to be skeptical about it. And that was not the case. Overall, people were very concerned. There was no real plastic pollution denial. What you can also do with this data is then try to tease apart the factors that predict concern. You take all of this together and then you ask, or you run a regression analysis, for example, and you ask what are the major factors that predict concern. And that's what we did as well. And we found that there were different types of factors. For example, we had socio-demographic factors. We found age and education level. The higher, the more concerned people were. We also found the frequency of noticing litter played a big role. So this personal experience factor. And you'll see this theme coming up again in the next study. And then also, of course, we were interested in psychological factors. And we found that people who had high altruistic and biospheric values, so they were really concerned, they were really valuing wildlife and the natural environment, they also demonstrated higher concern. And social norms, if other people around them were concerned. So that's this multiplication mechanism. Given the time, I'm just going to skip the fishermen, but basically we did a second study on fishermen, and they also showed the same level of concern. The other thing I want to show you from Microscopic is we asked the general public to tell us about all these different actors in society. we said to the general public, so what do you think? Who's responsible here? And who's competent and who's motivated? So this one's showing us general public responses for different stakeholder groups. So government policymakers, industry, commercial users, etc. And if we just take that apart for a moment, one of the questions was responsibility. Who do you think is responsible? And you see on the left-hand side, the red bars, government policymakers, industry and commercial users, and also the general public itself, they were seen as highly responsible. And that falls a little bit, but not hugely. So actually, people think responsibility is shared. Lots of people are responsible for this problem, which is a good starting point. There's not a single source. If you then look at the motivation, that's the green bars, you can see quite a discrepancy. So for example, those people who are seen as highly responsible, they aren't seen as very motivated, and that's a problem. So if you're responsible but not motivated, you're not trusted to do something about it. The people who were seen as motivated are the people at this end, so environmental groups, independent scientists, educators, and also the person who answered the questionnaire. So it's just a few examples about perception research. These were relatively general, so marine litter makes sense. We've worked on this a number of years. What do we actually know about microplastics? And again, in the SAPEA report, we summarized this, and we found last year the evidence was very limited and quite mixed. And there was a focus at the time on cosmetics. So I think there's still no data on, for example, tires as sources. So no study has asked people what they think about that as a source for microplastics. But this is changing very fast. The new data is emerging very fast. What we found last year was mixed data. So, for example, UK and US respondents said, I don't really know what this is. I have no idea even where to find microplastics and what it means. I don't think there are any in cosmetics, so really lack of awareness of perception. Having said that, there was actually a German study where around 60%, so more than half, already worried about plastic particles in food and drinking water. I was quite surprised by that because that was very early, but so, like I said, there's mixed evidence. It could be important to think about the lack of visibility. So while you can assess macro items of litter quite easily, you see them lying around on the beach, for example, you can't usually assess nano and microplastics, especially at the smaller end of the scale. So you have to completely rely on experts to tell you what the risk is, which makes it a question of trust. And I said already, this is changing quite quickly as new data emerging now. And I want to just give you one example of research we did. It's a small scale qualitative study, but it links to a study that Richard showed where Imogen Napper extracted particles from a range of cosmetic products, in this case always face peeling products. And she did the natural science study there, the environmental science one. She counted the particles, but she also produced these beautiful samples that she then gave to us to explore with samples of people. So we were able to show this to people, give it to them to handle, and they could tell us their responses to it. So it's a small scale qualitative study, and we invited 3 groups of people: beauticians because they handle these things, environmentalists because we felt they should be fairly informed, and students as a captive audience. And we were particularly keen on this experiential factor. So having the opportunity to look at this and handle it, would that really make a big impression? And just to point out, the product on the left hand side is the men's one, so they need more microplastics because they're harder. What did we find here? I'll just show you one slide. So it's qualitative, so we recorded their responses and then we looked through them. We found it did trigger thoughts on impacts, and they were either quite elaborate or not so elaborate. The beauticians, this is a sort of representative quote: yeah, it's quite dangerous, it's just bad for the world around us. So this wasn't in-depth analysis, but they were saying this is not normal, this is a bit weird. Whereas the students explored a bit more. So where does it go? Does it harm the fish? Does it go in the stomach and then poison them? So they started really thinking about it. The environmentalists knew the story. They didn't really add anything here. But what we also found is that people immediately thought about competing issues. So, well, there's lots of problems in the world, and what can we really do about it? So there was a bit of drawing back from this issue that we showed them. And what's key here is that these perceptions, or you can call them mental models, perhaps, they're crucial for developing effective communications and solutions. It works much better when you understand where people are coming from. So they have a theory about what happens with these. They go, oh, no, this goes down the drain, and then it goes in the river, and then it goes to the marine environment, and I don't like that. So it's a really useful starting point to develop interventions. That was a very quick summary, and I just want to now link it to some of the things we're doing in LimnoPlast. So first of all, the group in the University of Bergen and Roven and Gisela made these slides available. Thank you very much. They will follow up more the mental models approach. So they will ask people what they think the causes and consequences of microplastics are, who's affected, what happens next, and so on. And then they will link this to the risk perceptions, to the moral and emotional responses, and then finally to behavioral and policy preferences. So that's continuing work on the mental models. A second project that I'm involved with is, oh, and I should say the ESI is Marcos, who will pick up this work. Second project I'm involved with is with Maya Grunzner, who is supervised by both Richard and myself, and she's just moved to the University of Vienna as well. And her project will look at behavioral approaches to microplastics, which is completely novel. It's not been done before, and it'd be very exciting. In a few years' time, we'll hear what she's found. I just want to highlight that her step one is to gather expert views on sources and solutions, and she wants to do that hopefully as part of the micro conference. And I hope some of you will be willing to answer this questionnaire, because it gives us a starting point for what to focus on. So just to highlight that. And then the final ESR that I've had to do with already is Aybüke Ozdemir. She's at the Fraunhofer Institute, and she will focus on life cycle analysis and behavior. So you can see how these ESRs, these projects, are embedded in the systems approach, in this idea that behavior matters, the human dimension matters, risk perception, mental models, and behavior matters. And having talked a lot about behavior change, I want to give you an insight into some recent work we've been doing on behavior change. I can't show you this for microplastics because it doesn't exist yet. I haven't seen any study that looks at behavior in the context of microplastics, but I'll show you some general principles and things we've done in the past. So the first study, again, is from the Microscopic project. It's a study we linked to one of the sub-projects, which was a video contest with school kids. And this was great fun because all over Europe, we had over 300 school kids who produced videos that they then submitted, and they were rated, and they got a prize and so on. And it's great to see this creativity, to see kids really getting involved in this. And this is my personal favorite. It wasn't actually the one that won the prize for the UK, but it's a group of primary school kids in Shetland who came up with a little video story where they told a story about this fisherman who goes out to sea, eats his crisps for lunch, throws the packet overboard, and then the packet it drifts to the coast, and this poor little bird eats it and he gets sick. And then they end the whole video with a story of the community getting together and think, what do we do about it? We'll clean it all up. So the community cleanup is the solution. It's a beautiful little story. So this is one of the videos that the children made. They were all different. Every country, every school did a different video. But what we did around this video contest is we asked them to report their own behaviors. And we did that before they took part and after they took part. And this gives us some insight into behavior. And here's the data. So we can see these are pro-environmental behaviors, anti-plastic, anti-littering behaviors, separating litter for recycling, using reusables, avoiding plastic bags, encouraging others. So we wanted the social component in there as well, and so on. And we can see that they reported better behavior afterwards, with the intervention being this really creative, open-ended. There was no lesson plan or anything. It was just their creativity that they used. And there seems to be a positive effect of this. So here's one example how we can try to motivate behavior. And I'll just show you this again to remind you. We said this earlier, that there are a range of factors that you can use to trigger, to motivate behavior. And it would be nice in the next study to perhaps understand a bit more what determined the change in these children. So we didn't measure any of these factors. We just looked at behavior before and after, because it would be good to understand what exactly it is. Did the videos, making the videos trigger certain emotions? Did it trigger a sense of we're all in this together? That sort of question. Stepping back from these individual factors, another way of thinking about behavior change is by using this information motivation skills model. And you can see there are three big factors that predict behavior. There is information. I said information isn't very strong, but information is still part of this. So this is the what. What's the problem? What do I have to do? But distinguished from that is the motivation, which is the question, why should I do something? So I said earlier, there's a behavior in health where people know what to do, and yet that's very different from having the motivation to do something. So two distinct factors here. We need to consider both. And then there's the behavioral skills. So how do I actually do this? Now, this might sound funny if you're in plastic, but there are actually skills associated with what you do to avoid plastic, to reduce plastic. For example, you're trying to use more reusables. You need to figure out how to clean them. You need to remember them, and so on. And that is a degree of skill that people have to learn. And only those three things together result in the behavior change that we want in general. And that's the prize. That's what we really want. So what we're doing at the moment in terms of behavior changes, in a different product, we're running scoping reviews about behavior change for different sectors: tourism, schools, business and retail, and communities. And this is in progress at the moment. So I just thought I'll show you a few of the early insights. Again, I was quite disappointed about the level of evidence there was. There isn't actually very much published evidence, good quality scientific studies. There's few published studies, and it's mixed. Some interventions have positive outcomes, others don't. So this is focusing all on behavior change. Also interesting, and that's quite an important point about behavior change, is often you need to think about the constraints and the infrastructure in which you're trying to achieve change. And that's a truism for behavior change approaches. You can't do it in a vacuum. You really need to think about what the constraints are for the person. Is it financial? Is it infrastructural? And that's sometimes what critics of behavior change say. You can't do any individual behavior change. Often it's actually a criticism of the infrastructure lacking, or the infrastructure contradicting what you're trying to achieve. There's some evidence that a combination of measures works best, which makes sense. So you have a bigger arsenal, you get more results. And also, we talked about values, we talked about emotions, but actually the practical things are also important. Convenience, proximity to disposal, for example, is key as well. From this scoping review, I just want to show you a few examples of what we found, just to get a sense of what's out there and how behavior change can actually happen. So, for example, when we looked at recycling, we found a study that communicated how you recycle. And what this study suggests is that if you tell people about product transformation, so recyclables have a new life, they get made into the same products again, or they get made into other new products, that increases recycling. So it's a significant improvement, in this case, in observed recycling behavior. It's quite good data. And I think that could be a motivating effect about telling people, this is not the end of it. You're not just putting it in that recycling bin and have no idea what happens next, but it's actually telling you something else happens. I said earlier, social influence or social norms are really important. And here's a study that worked around a festival and trialed different labelings. So the pictures on the right-hand side and the bottom give you an idea of what the different labels were. But they found just putting a person there, even if he didn't intervene, he didn't interact with the people, improved recycling behavior in this case, improved disposal behavior. So social influence, social norms are definitely very important. Closer to home, Richard and I are supervising a PhD student called Sophie Njoja, and she's been interested in consumer decisions in particular. And she's been very interested in linking the behavior to values, to something people really care about. And what she did was measure ocean connectedness as an indicator of what people care about. Do they feel really close to the ocean? And then give people a choice between different products. And what this graph shows is that if people are low in ocean connectedness on the left-hand side, they don't distinguish between recyclable and non-recycled products. They go, well, I'll buy either of them. I don't really mind. If they're high in ocean connectedness, that's on the right-hand side, they distinguish between those. They really like recyclable. They really dislike non-recyclable. So that's an attempt of bringing the two together. So you care about something, and that can really make a difference for what you decide to do in terms of product choice. And very similar, I did a study with some colleagues in Canada at a large office building where we implemented different signage. So on the left-hand side, that's the one they had before, standard. This is what you should recycle. Then they made a sign on the second from the left where they improved the signage, made it clearer and so on. The third one is the one that we were particularly interested in because it makes the link to wildlife effects. So what happens if the plastic escapes and so on, the thing that motivates many of us to deal with plastic pollution. And signage plus pledge is using a psychological approach that's shown. If you sign a pledge, you're more likely to then do the behavior. And this isn't published yet, so revision is under review. But this is data from the bins showing the percentage of plastics across all bins. There was no difference actually in the bins. And what we found, interestingly and perhaps a little strangely, is that the picture with the wildlife impact had the biggest effect during the intervention and also after the intervention. And what happened was that percentage plastic dropped across all bins. So it seems to have motivated a reduction in use rather than better recycling behavior or something like that. So I think this is quite intriguing, but the exciting thing is that it's got objective data, so objective behavior data. I'm gonna skip the next slide because I'm running a little bit low. And maybe just highlight, I quite like this report that Plastic Oceans have published together with Earthwatch, because it's the only report really I've seen so far that very seriously thinks about the behavioral dimensions. So in this case, it goes by item. So they pick the top items that we find on the coast and in the sea. And then they said, what can we actually do about it? What sort of behavior can we change here? And they give very practical tips. So use reusable water bottle, get a milk delivery. That's perhaps UK specific, but they're telling people very much what the how is. How can you do these changes? So that's a bit about behavior change. If I've got a couple of minutes, I just want to highlight something we're doing for UNEP at the moment. Again, Richard and I are leading this work, which is a stock take of global actions to reduce the flow of marine plastic and microplastic to the ocean. It's pursuant to a UNEA resolution that was concluded, I think, 2 years ago. And we ran a survey that got sent out by UNEP and asked people to report any actions they do. There are actions on microplastics in there, but we haven't analyzed those yet. So I just want to show you a really broad level summary. We had submissions from all over the world. This is just showing a little geographic representation. And then we distinguished between types of actions. We asked people, what's the major type of action you're reporting here? Is it a legislative, a standard, a rule type action? Is it monitoring and analysis? Is it technology and processes? Or is it working with people? And interestingly, from all those actions reported, we found that working with people was the top category, 44% of actions reported. And that means awareness raising, behavior change, but also capacity building. And then with those categories, we were also able to plot this against the life cycle. Again, think back on to the systems approach, think back to what Richard said. It's important to start earlier to reduce the flow of plastic. And what you can see here on the right-hand side is a distinction between before use and during after use. And the vast majority of actions were during and after use. So that in this category at the top, and that was even more prominent for the working with people actions. So it's often end of pipe, end of line where these actions take place, cleanups from the environment, for example. And that's me pretty much done. Just to show you a positive photo, things can happen. This is in Jakarta where people cleaned up the river. And a few conclusions. People's decisions and behaviors play a key role in the plastic system. And I think social and behavioral sciences research can help develop effective solutions. Of course, we need other perspectives as well, but we need to be in the mix because they can address the risk to the success of bans, to disincentive programs that might not work if human behavior is not considered. And I would appeal to you, think about more than just information when aiming at behavior change, and think about the interactions between this. And the final slide is just a thank you to all the brilliant collaborators who've helped with this research. Thank you very much.